Our passage today is Luke chapter 19 and commencing at verse 45. That is, Luke chapter 19, commencing at verse 45, and only 3 verses. Then he entered the temple area and began driving out those who were selling. It is written, he said to them, "My house will be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of robbers." Every day he was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they could not find any way to do it, because all the people hung on his words. Let me say first of all that the core doctrine underpinning this sermon, although there are many applications that I will make after that, that core doctrine is the humanity and the deity of Christ. And whenever I preach on this doctrine, or preach any sermon that builds on this doctrine, I feel a little like Moses must have, and I say a little because, of course, we could never feel fully like that, when God said, "The ground on which you are standing is holy ground." On this doctrine, we can veer towards heresy so easily, mainly because it's the foundational doctrine upon which the entire plan of redemption rests. The hypostatic union of the divine and the human is critical for our faith, and it doesn't make any sense to the maths types because Christ is 100% divine and 100% human. But so much for Enlightenment maths, it doesn't really help us there. Fortunately, the scriptures are clear on this. It's critical. Most of the heresies that the church had to fight are around this, whether it be Gnosticism, the Arian heresy, Jehovah's Witness heresy, the Mormon heresy, and I'd even say that there are some movements today that detract from the divinity or the humanity of Christ. So, let's have a look at the event itself before I get into the doctrines and, more importantly, the applications that emerge. It's important to note that this is quite late in Luke, but in the Gospel of John, this account is early. In fact, it's probably not this account. It might be an indication that this was done more than once. It is also like that, for example, with other events, whether it's walking on the water or feeding the 4,000 and 5,000. We know, of course, that definitely was two accounts. But the higher criticism types, and now that's a school of thought that has developed in the sort of post-Enlightenment age, and it emphasizes the non-divine source or non-divine basis for the revelation in Scripture, and it really just treats Scripture as any old historical document, complete with lots of mistakes and so forth. And they would insist that there was confusion between the writers of the Gospels when it came to the events and the timeline. But of course, we believe in the harmony of the Gospels, and we would then have to accept that this happened more than once. It's not rocket science. It really just takes a little bit of intelligence and a little less skepticism, and all we can do is then work out the timeline. I was just reading this morning in my devotions of the accounts of the discovery of the empty tomb and how the different Gospels account for different people at the scene and different events. Once again, not rocket science. One can just draw them together and understand that from different points of view, different angles, these writers of the Gospels, all four Gospels, recorded the events in different ways. They can work together. So, looking at the particular events here, let's just make a couple of points. Interestingly, Luke is far more factual and less involving than the other accounts. Okay, Mark chapter 11, for example, in his recounting of this event. He mentions it, and of course, if we look at the entire account in all of the Gospels, Christ would have entered the previous evening through what was known as the Shushan Gate, and I'm guessing he would also have noticed the desecration of the temple in this way, the money changers and so forth. That would have been the evening of Palm Sunday, and then he would have returned the next day. So, and I know this is speculation, but I think it's warranted, the anger was brewing. All right. That's, of course, my interpretation on top of it. I don't really have a license to say that that's biblical, but I think we're allowed that. If we take the other accounts, and this is not recorded in Luke, in fact, Luke's account of these events is regarded as the least, should I say, emotive, least detailed. It's just purely factual. He glosses over it. But the other accounts say that Christ sat beforehand and actually made a proper whip. He gathered some cords and he weaved them together. In South African parlance, perhaps we would understand this as a kind of a shambok. And of course, only South Africans would understand it, but with many tails. Okay, and of course, the old reference to the cat of nine tails comes to mind. Not that it was exactly like that, but we have here, as the Old English says, a scourge of cords. That would have taken time, taken maybe a couple of hours to do. So this was clearly premeditated. Clearly, this was something that Christ was planning to do. It was not, as once again the higher critics would insist, an uncontrolled tantrum, or some of them maybe would insist that because they would see Christ as just a human. I read somewhere once, and I wish I could find it again, that this open courtyard was something like a huge flea market. Very large expanse, and the artist rendition I will show you now will display that. Here's a model depicting Herod's temple that would have been built, still under construction. But this huge expanse is full of tables and wicker baskets with pigeons in them. Of course, there must be containers that hold the money that is changed. There was always money involved, by the way. We must just make that clear. A certain amount was required to be paid, a half a shekel annually, for temple tax. But this had clearly got out of control. Christ would have stood in a position where his voice would boom across the courtyard. And as he approached, the flying tables and the wicker baskets, that is with pigeons in them, would have presented quite a frightening spectacle to anyone observing this. The rebuke of Jesus was addressed mainly to the priests, because the market belonged to them. The money changers, or perhaps in the modern parlance we would refer to them as pimps, they were their agents and they collected the money. Alfred Edersheim, who wrote the great work, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, says that the annual traffic alone cleared the priests about $300,000 a year. He would know. He understood Jewish culture intricately, much more than we do, and he arrived at that sum. That's remarkable, and it also shows us the extent to which something which is originally designed purely to maintain order and structure very easily gets out of control and then it becomes a huge racket. And of course, we're all too aware of that. One commentator I read, and I wished I hadn't, but just to bear in mind that we sometimes come across commentators who really don't give us the proper account. I remember reading Spurgeon's book on commentators saying that the one commentary he heard written by Pyle was a pile of rubbish, but that, of course, was the way Spurgeon used to put things. The one commentator I read tried to fit Christ into a very woke mold, this very seeker-sensitive and very, should I even say, kind of passive mold, and that he was very careful in the way in which he upturned the tables, and he didn't harm the pigeons, and he made sure that they could get their money back. Well, that's just absolute rubbish. Absolute rubbish. This was, let's use the modern word, this was violent. And this was anger, real anger. So that brings me to my first point, the issue around deranged behavior. Normally, this would be ascribed to deranged behavior. Any observant would say, well, look at this man, he's lost it. Okay, he's upsetting the establishment, that which has been accepted by the average Joe. But here's the point. The establishment is wrong. He's come to rectify it. He's establishing his authority. He's reverting it back to what it should be. He's trying to do that. He's showing them that. Okay. The argument might be, but this is where people do business. Well, that would be the accepted norm, but it's not the way it was designed. He's saying to them, you can call it the new normal if you want to, but this is not right. God never intended the temple to be desecrated this way, and he comes here to disrupt it. That's what he does. Yes, this is gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Of course, a caricature of Christ that has no biblical warrant. He is gentle, he is meek, but we need to take the entire gospel account so that we can understand what kind of person this is. You see, he's not a modern-day social justice warrior. This is not the same. All right? This is proper activism for a cause that has to do with God's holiness and God's honor. Even though it acts itself out in a temporal and a material environment, the stakes are very high here because the consequences and the issues go way beyond the here and now. And let's not confuse this with political activism. There have been a number of people who've tried to do that as well. The woke tribe today would have us believe that. Perhaps they would want us to understand that Christ is seriously aggrieved about social issues of the day. This is not the case. That would be to justify the hooligan activities of the likes of groups like Antifa on the left and QAnon on the right and so forth. And the revolutionaries who are bored with sitting in their parents' homes and with their PlayStations dreaming of future utopias. No. Some would also try to justify it in terms of the despicable 1789 French Revolution, which was despicable. It was just pure violence and a bloody revolution. Or the even worse one in 1917 in Russia, which some people think was a marvelous thing, but in that century alone resulted in the death of over 100 million people. No, Christ is aggrieved about the desecration of the temple. This is more like Martin Luther posting the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, or Wycliffe defying the authorities and translating the scriptures into English, or like Paul telling Festus and Felix that they need to fix their ways, or like John Bunyan writing Pilgrim's Progress from prison, or the Huguenots leaving their country and coming to, for example, South Africa, or the Pilgrims not bending under the yoke of the church of the day, but establishing colonies in America. Something, of course, that the current day Americans don't really recognize, or most of them don't really recognize. Their greatness is, whatever greatness they had, was built on that. Or let's take it to a modern day, a contemporary setting, the Californian situation. California is, of course, a cesspool of lefty politics and progressive, so-called progressive policies. John MacArthur telling Governor Newsom, we will have church no matter what you say. This is telling him, I don't think so. Now, once again, that's not political. It's not about politics. It might well have been against a right-wing leadership as well. I mean, it's not the point. The point is this. This is about God's glory. This is about worship. And while I do respect the laws and I do respect the concerns about the current pandemic, I'm just a little concerned that Christians are a little too acquiescent when it comes to these laws. You know, it's quite fine to have gyms open and to have malls open and to have business running, which I agree with, by the way. It should happen. But churches are shut down? Oh no, and it's quite fine to have political protests as well, and to plunder shops and to burn stuff. But church must stay away. It's ludicrous. It really is ludicrous. But bear in mind, of course, there are good reasons why the lockdown should be enforced, and there are good reasons why social distancing should be obeyed. This one respects. But there is a line. And when the authorities step over that line, we should push back. What's interesting also is in terms of this particular temple, AD 70 does beckon only 40 years, 37 years after this. Vespasian and Titus would invade Jerusalem, and despite stern resistance, they would raze it to the ground, and this temple would be destroyed. In fact, the last stand of the Jews is really right here in this position where Christ is standing. Their last stand. I've seen documentaries on that particular battle. It was a protracted battle. They clung to their heritage. They'd lost all sense, of course. They'd lost all sense of its eternal significance. But for them it was national fervor, with some kind of patina of spirituality attached. But when Titus finally conquered, it was really there in the temple. That was the last stand. After that, it was just a total pushover. The temple was gone. The people were crushed. Rome would recolonize surrounding areas, establish its power in Palestine again, and even the Maccabean revolt of the intertestamental period had some success, and the temple was rebuilt and so forth. But here, the temple would never ever be rebuilt again, to this very day. So the point here is, of course, zeal for God's kingdom. That's my second point. So we spoke about the so-called deranged behavior, and now we're talking about the zeal for God's kingdom. It is here where we see the human, the one who grieves over the desecration of God's honor and holiness, but in very human ways, in ways we can identify with. If we look at the timeline, we can see that the anger is increasing. Of course, he is the man of sorrows. And the reason for that is, of course, we know that's prophetic. There is wry humor and irony in his ministry, but there is no account of Christ enjoying a good joke and laughing. And I'm often amazed at these movies about Jesus, this constant supercilious smile on his face, not to mention the Cockney accent. It's rubbish. Man of sorrows. And here you see the anger that has been building. It it now expresses itself. The sorrow and melancholy increases over the course of his 3-year ministry as the fullness of this ministry and the purpose of it begins to be stamped down and hammered down with those around him. And they can see that this is growing. And of course, this is at a crucial moment. This is the day after Palm Sunday. This is within the week that he would be murdered. This is just before Gethsemane and the Last Supper. So what was on his mind? Well, look at the previous passage. He had just wept over Jerusalem, weeping. Centuries of disobedience, centuries of stiff-necked refusal to accept God's ways. Since the Exodus, 40 years in the wilderness of groaning, grumbling, and whining against God's ways. This is after 400 years of silence between the testaments, all the while watching his people become more and more corrupt, more and more spiritually bereft, more and more in need of a shake-up. And the shake-up has come. And then before that, of course, that is now in this particular passage, he curses the fig tree, which also shows a kind of edginess to his behavior. Is this human enough? Am I allowed that interpretation? I can accommodate that as a human response. Of course, we do know that the cursing of the fig tree was his very stern and very sober recognition that Israel had not produced the fruit it should have. The Old Testament prophet saying that God had tilled the soil, had given it air, had allowed it time to produce fruit, and still it was barren. Therefore, he now curses it. Even here, as he stands in the temple courtyard, he's pretty much in exactly the same position that Jeremiah stood when he warned of the coming wrath. Certainly in the same vicinity. Remember Jeremiah warning of the Babylonian invasion, the imminent invasion. And of course that did happen. Once again, the higher critics would have said that that was written afterwards and it was shoehorned in. No, that's rubbish. The prophecy was clear. They were coming, and of course we know they did come. And that reminds him, of course, of all the prophets who were killed by their own people, and he too is about to be killed by them. Matthew 23:35. So that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And then, of course, there's the other event, one which is really the tipping point. And we look at the confluence and the harmony of the Gospels, John chapter 11. John chapter 11 is a tipping point, certainly in the book of John. But it is in John chapter 11 where, of course, he makes his way towards Jerusalem, which is very dangerous for him because already their grudges are building. Their resistance to him is fermenting to the point that it is about to explode. And it is in John chapter 11 where he raises Lazarus from the dead that they then decide, the Sanhedrin then decide, we're going to kill this guy. That's it. Even there, you can see the tension is almost unbearable. Because when he calls for Lazarus to walk out the tomb, he bellows like an ox. This is anger. And just before that, the weeping with Mary. The shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35. Jesus wept. Why the anger? We know the weeping is because of the situation that he finds himself in. Of course, the weeping is because of death. But the anger as well because of our pitiful situation. That's why. Because he sees it very differently to the way we see it. He doesn't see death as the peaceful exit after a life of amazing achievements, and empire building, and career construction, and launching your children. No, for him, death the wages of sin. And he knows for Lazarus to rise from the dead, which happened, he has to be put to death. That also accounts for the anger. And this, of course, puts an entirely different perspective on a whole lot of other events. You will recall coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration at the base of the mount. The anger at seeing people who couldn't cast a demon out. Oh, wicked and perverse generation. There's anger there. It's about our pitiful situation. That's what we are, you see. We're losers. We are like lambs to the slaughter. And then, of course, the grief and the deep anguish of Gethsemane, which follows this, and the sweating of blood. Try to imagine the pain. We have no hope of really imagining the extent of it. We may have a tiny bit of the intent of it, but not the extent of it. The immense pressure of knowing what he was in for. He'd already told the disciples to prepare the way for him to Jerusalem, and he knew what was coming. We have no idea of what he is about to face. We know the history, but it's much more than that. It's pain and terror at levels we can't even begin to comprehend. Interestingly, the pain and terror that we deserve, which makes our situation even more pitiful. We don't even know what we deserve. It would be so great that the Christ would cry out in prayer, and this is his humanity. Father, if at all possible, if at all possible. But we know that it wasn't. This was the only way that sin would be atoned for. And this afterlife of 30 years in this world, having to live as God in the flesh of humanity, and according to the book of Philippians, giving up all he had to become man, and seeing the pathetic state of humanity around him, slaves to sin and lambs to the slaughter. Now, I know this is depressing, but it's important to understand this, because the glory of what we're looking at is only apparent once we understand the situation that it addresses. There are many accounts of Christ's anger, especially as the day draws near, which isn't to suggest that he is losing control or losing composure. Every time he heals, every time he raises from the dead, there are signs of this frustration. And when I say frustration, I don't mean lack of composure. It's just the huge difference between what he stands for and what he is and what we are. And remember, he says, they are like sheep without a shepherd. Imagine knowing this, and knowing that you were the answer to this, and knowing what it would take to fix this. The full extent of that. And not only for the people of his time, but for the people preceding that, and for the people like us who will succeed that. You see, we as Christians only have a sense of it when we see the state of humanity, seeing people flock to their rock concerts, and, to the mall. Obviously, in one sense, that's all part and parcel of life, and in some cases necessary. But I was reminded of this, it was some years ago, of course it was in France, wasn't it? There was a rock concert that was attacked by some fundamentalist freaks, and people were murdered in cold blood. But what really made it so pathetic, as tragic as it was, is that the band that was playing at the concert was celebrating death. It's just mind-blowing. That is how pathetic we are. And now I understand something of Christ's frustration. I understand that. Christ knows, he knows fully why we are in the position we are in, though we don't. But as I said, up until now, you would say, well, this is all terribly negative and everything, isn't it? Well, yes, of course, it's important to understand the negative. But let's look at this. Despite all this pressure, all this anguish, he shows grace and compassion. It's quite remarkable. While he's walking here, just before this, remember the triumphal entry, he's approaching Jerusalem. And what happens is a blind person calls out to him, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And this is the most remarkable thing. It's a bit like the woman who reaches out and touches the hem of his robe while he's being bustled around, moved around, so forth. And this guy calls out twice, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And he stops and he heals the man. In amidst all of this pressure, all of this anguish, he stops, he turns around, and he deals with this man's problem. And this, together with the weeping over Jerusalem, this together with the clearing of the temple courts, you just put it all together and you get such a wonderful sort of profile of this. Sorry to sound so anemic, but you get a fuller picture of the person of Jesus Christ. With Lazarus, he weeps. Jerusalem, he weeps. We can be so thankful that he weeps, because in that weeping is sheer compassion, in addition to the frustration and the anger. God doesn't owe us any tears, nothing. We've chosen our way, we've chosen our rebellion. All we deserve is his rejection. That's what we deserve. Complete and utter rejection. But to add insult to injury, what humanity does is it stands up and it shakes its fist in God's face, as if it actually has a case. We have no case. All we have is this offer of salvation, this offer of rescue. What an amazing rescue it is. It's a complete and utter salvation to the fullest, a redemption of our souls, and even beyond that, a new body. And in exchange, what does it require? Well, it's not really like we make a payment. It's just faith. Faith is not a payment. It's not a work. When you give a gift to your child at Christmas, all she has to do is just reach out her hands and take it. Well, that's what God requires of us. Faith. That's why the disciples cried to him, "Lord, increase our faith." And the Roman says to him, "Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief." One of those paradoxical statements, a bit like Paul on the Damascus Road. Lord, who are you? Imagine that, all your lostness, all your disobedience, all your idolatry, all your weakness taken off you and placed on him. He became one of us so that we could become one with him. And what do we gain? All his righteousness, all his perfection. And the debt is clear. I was watching a debate the other night. I like watching the apologetics debates. And of course, it was always a desired thing to get Christopher Hitchens on the stage and to take him on because of his immense articulacy and his incisive comments and so forth. And it was a case of 4 Christians against him. But it was really in good humor. It really, and because Douglas Wilson was involved, who had a very close relationship with Hitchens, and kudos to Wilson for having actually won the friendship of Christopher Hitchens over. Very clever. Not seeker-sensitive rubbish, no. He he formed that bond with Hitchens. And if there's any hope for Hitchens, and I sincerely doubt Hitchens is in the right place right now, but if there is any hope, a lot of it would be attributable to the wonderful witness of Douglas Wilson. But the one argument that came up, well, there were two arguments that came up that Christopher Hitchens really struggled with, although he puts on a brave face and he dismisses them with his clever wit and all this, that, and the other, and his acerbic cynicism and all that. But you could see it struck home when Christopher Hitchens and Wilson argue. I mean, Elaine Craig was there, and Lee Strobel was there, and another guy, I forget his name. But when Hitchens and Wilson argue over John Lennon's song, Imagine, No Heaven, No Hell, that despicable song that I see many in the left want to make the new anthem for America. Fancy that. And Hitchens says, well, this God you believe in, he looks down from that sky and he folds his arms while people suffer. And Wilson turns around and says to him, at least we have a God that looks down and acts. Your sky above you is indifferent. It doesn't care at all. There's nothing. And then we look at this, and we look at Jesus. And we look at the compassion, and we look at what he did, what he went through. And we have hope. We have immense hope. It's incredible what hope we have. We don't have an indifferent God who looks down on us. I don't know who it was who said after 9/11, when of course the clever and cocky atheist said, well, where's your God now? I said, well, you'd better hope there's a God. Imagine with 9/11 there is no God. Then what situation are you in? So here are two major applications I want to make to close off. And it's going to seem strange, but I'm going to talk now about suffering. Because in essence, we're talking about the suffering of Jesus Christ, are we not? But I want to extend that to our suffering and to talk about how this addresses our suffering. John Piper was once asked, I saw in an interview with him, Don Carson, and Tim Keller, the question was, what makes a good preacher? And in fact, Keller and Carson had different opinions. Carson would normally talk about excellent doctrine and that kind of stuff, because his mind and his ability to understand doctrine is really quite astounding. And I'm not sure what Keller said, but Piper said this: suffering makes a good preacher. So now we see suffering in a different light. It's difficult, but I honestly don't know of anyone who has ever truly grown in gratitude as a result of great material blessing, health, wealth. And God does choose to bless some people with health and wealth. It's not dancing to the DNA, it's God's will. But I don't know of anyone who falls down on their knees and experiences gratitude or expresses gratitude to the extent that they do once they've gone through the portals of suffering and have come out stronger at the end. That is when the heart is truly receptive and when the attitude is truly grateful. God uses suffering. We all know that C.S. Lewis said it's his megaphone. And of course, C.S. Lewis experiencing the death of a wife only after a couple of years of marriage due to cancer. God reduces us to a point of our own helplessness so that we look to him. And we see it throughout the Gospels. We see it with the disciples losing hope in the boat when Christ is sleeping, and fearful when he walks on the water. We see them just shrugging and saying, what do we do now? At every turn. because they were forced to look to him. They are destitute. And that's what suffering produces. It produces that sense of an awareness of how pathetic we are in our own resources. So how does this connect with the lessons above? Well, when you become a Christian in some small way, you start experiencing suffering to begin to understand. And it's not about a payment. It's got nothing to do with a payment. He suffered for us. It's all done and dusted. It's the upside down gospel. It's like no other religion on the planet. It's got things backwards if you compare it to the other religions. But suffering helps us understand the price that was paid. It doesn't help us pay the price. It helps us understand the price that was paid. I have to be careful here because, of course, it could be perceived as a kind of legalism. But it's not. That's what suffering does. As Don Carson says, it's going to happen. Either you die early or you get kicked in the teeth, which is his particular way of saying it. So how do I understand and appreciate what Christ did for me if I don't in some way just understand the situation, the human situation? Do you think a life of abundant blessing, of health, wealth is going to intensify your walk with Jesus? That would be highly unusual. There are some examples offered from the Old Testament of that being the case. I even doubt them, the Abrahams, Josephs, and Daniels of the world. Because if you read between the lines, there were deep flaws there as well. Yes, it is paradoxical, but it is necessary. And when you see suffering in that light, then it takes on an entirely different complexion, doesn't it? Then you begin to understand the point. Then it's not just no heaven, no hell. Then it's the eternal stakes. The stakes are huge here. And what do? You run to this Jesus Christ. You run to him. Because he has suffered everything for us. Then finally, prayer. I can't underscore this enough. I'm sure we all as Christians experience that longing. If you don't experience a longing for prayer, certainly the discipline of prayer is difficult. We all struggle with that. But the desire has to be there. I don't know how many people like me wake up at night. I'm sure we all do. Wake up at night sometimes and you just get this longing to speak to God. You've got to have communion with him. You've got to engage with him. He's not just a theoretical God in your readings. He's not even just a person you read about who suffered. You've got to talk to him. There is more than being happy about a blessing. There is more than being sad about a sin we've committed. All those are necessary. But there's the desire and the need to engage with him. I don't want to say eye to eye. But you know that old verse in the Old Testament, you're the apple of the eye? Well, the Hebrew is, you are the pupil of my eye. The image on the pupil. Like when lovers look each other in the eye and they see each other's reflections in the pupils of their eyes. Well, that's what it is. There's the pouring your heart out before him, of engaging with him. He covets that. He desires that. The reason we often live lives of unfulfilled growth and promise is because we haven't taken this up. This is a gift we've been given. And we treat it like it's at the back end of every day and it's 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there. We need to properly engage with God. Martin Luther, at times in his life, especially after he had rejected the fake church, the papacy of the day, after he had exposed Tetzel and the indulgences, after he had then suffered the indignity of having to stand before all the clergy at the Diet of Worms and the Diet of, and in Augsburg. He was, of course, as you know, kidnapped by good people and hidden. And during that time, he would translate the scriptures into German, I think in a number of weeks. Enormous amount of work. And he said, when I've got a lot of work, when I've got excessive work, when I've got more work than I can cope with in a day, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I need to get up early. So that's logical, isn't it? That's what we do. We get up early to start the work. No. He said, I need to get up early to pray more. That's what he did. To cover that work, he had to pray more. You see, this is a relationship. This is not just a Bible reading. This is not just going to church. This is not just saying your prayers. This is a proper relationship. That's what that act on the cross made possible for us. Shame on us if we don't use it and we don't pray. God love you.